Hey YouTube, I'm back with another video. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the ARC A770 that I have had for a couple of weeks now, and I have been doing a lot of testing with it. I've been doing live streams with it to showcase its performance in real time for my subscribers and my viewers. So if you're very interested in this GPU and you want to see more content on it, I encourage you guys to check out the channel. There's a couple of videos, and there's just going to be more and more added over time as I continue to test this new GPU from Intel. So today what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at ray tracing, because I feel like when I engage with my audience, I think the vast majority of the questions pertain to ARC. What's my opinion of it? What's my impressions of it so far? And that sort of thing. So, and we're going to be comparing it with primarily the 6700 XT from AMD, because I feel like I said in my initial review over the rasterization, the power consumption, the value, that review video, I did think that this was the rival for that card, or the intended one at least. And because this card is AMD's first generation of ray tracing, I think that it is a valid comparison to see how Intel's ARC GPU stacks up against the first generation of ray tracing on Radeon. The other GPU that I'm going to be comparing it with is kind of like a kind of out in left field. So this is going to be the Radeon 6900 XT. We tried to pick out benchmarks that kind of cover a lot of bases in terms of different game engines, different rendering approaches. Like, for example, we have benchmarks for DXR, so DirectX ray tracing that AMD worked with Microsoft on, and then we've got like Crytek and that sort of stuff. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get on into the benchmarks. Alright, so now we're going to go over the results from my testing. This is going to go over all the different tests I did. Let's go ahead and get right into it. I think my results will be a little bit more unique, but there will be some mainstream stuff in here as well. So the test setup, I'm still using the exact same test setup that I used for the review video when we covered the rasterization, the thermals, the power consumption, all that stuff for ARC. So it is still the Ryzen 7 5800X with an ROG X570 Crosshair Hero 8 motherboard, 64 gigabytes of G.Skill Ripjaws, running at 32 megahertz. Cast latency is, I believe it's 14, or maybe it's 16. I think it's 16. So cast latency 16, and the Seasonic Prime Titanium 1000 watt. So that is a 80 plus titanium. So that shouldn't cause any kind of weird issues with ripple or power delivery spikes and that sort of thing that could crop up when you're doing ray tracing benchmarks, because ray tracing uses a lot more power. It makes the GPU run at the maximum TDP that it's rated for typically. So we've seen this with the NVIDIA cards as well. So the Intel driver version is 31.0.101.3490, and the AMD driver version is the October driver. So here's the first benchmark that we did. So this is going to be Crytek's Neon Noir ray tracing benchmark. So this is a free to download benchmark, provided you have an account with Crytek, which is free to sign up. It's kind of like Epic Games with their Epic Games launcher. Crytek has their own launcher as well. This is good because this kind of shows it's a synthetic benchmark, but it is made using the Crytek engine. So that means that it will be similar in performance to games that are made by Crytek or using that engine technology. So this is going to be the 1080p results. You can see they give you a score. One thing I noticed when I was running this benchmark at 1080p as well as 1440p, the ARC was not as smooth on screen. I could see, not really hitching, but I noticed, like, you know, the drops in the FPS. I noticed like the millisecond response times were not really that good with this GPU. But, you know, in terms of the 1080p results, it's very close, roughly, with the 6700 XT in the middle there. So both of them were over 10,000. And then I did include the 6900 XT because I wanted to show, you know, kind of like what happens when you get a GPU that has really, really strong rasterization performance, and then you make it do ray tracing and see what the results look like. So this is the 1080p results. If we look at the 1440p results here, interestingly, ARC does overtake the 6700 XT at the higher resolution. But you can see all GPUs basically took a massive performance hit when we went up to 1440p. So that is kind of expected though, because ray tracing on both AMD and Intel, this is both the first generation of the ray tracing hardware. So for AMD, it's the Ray accelerators, and then Intel does have their dedicated hardware for ray tracing. So this is the only synthetic benchmark that I included, but I don't have a lot of Crytek games that support ray tracing. So I decided to go ahead and include this one because it was free, and I think it was a good one. This was the benchmark that was used originally to showcase ray tracing on Vega 64 back in the day. So yeah, that's why I thought it would be an interesting one to look at and see how ARC performs in it. So now we move on to the first game benchmark that we did for ray tracing. So this is going to be Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I did set the preset to ultra quality. And then for ray tracing, so ray tracing, to enable ray tracing, you cannot do it from within the game menu. You have to actually do it before you launch the game. There's a sub menu that comes up. So I think I chose high, and there is one level above high. I think it's ultra. I chose high because I did kind of want to see like what's a realistic representation for these GPUs when it comes to ray tracing. Because I think ultra is a little bit overkill, and then I don't think the results will be very good for either the ARC or the 6700 XT. So you can see here at 1080p, it's playable. Is it ideal? In my mind, no. Typically, I would like to have some amount of headroom when I'm playing the game at any given resolution. So in this case, I would say the 6700 XT at 96 average is better. That's kind of a little bit more comfortable. You have a little bit of wiggle room there. To handle the lower half of those averages. So again, the ARC GPU though, 78, not terrible, but it does kind of show us that this is probably the best we're going to get when it comes to ray tracing. It's probably going to be 1080p as the resolution. Very much like the first generation of the NVIDIA RTX cards, those being the 20 series. That's kind of what this performance looks like to me. If we look at so minimum FPS for these, ARC did 70 or 62, tied with the 6700 XT. Interestingly enough, they both have the exact same minimum at 1080p. The 6900 XT at 95. If we look at the maximum, this is pretty interesting. A lot of people don't really look at maximums. I know a lot of people like to weigh a lot heavily on minimum for those dips as well as the 1% lows. But the maximum does tell an interesting picture because the maximum, there is quite a bit of a difference there between the A770 and the 6700 XT. And then likewise, if you look at the AMD cards, you can kind of see there's really good scaling as you move up the performance stack, right? So the 6700 XT is in the middle. That's kind of like the upper mid-range card. And then you have, there would be the 6800 XT, which would fall right in between that card and the results for the 6900 XT, which are over 300 FPS. At 321. So it's kind of an interesting result to see here. And then if we look at the total frames rendered for 1080p, this is something that the Shadow of the Tomb Raider's benchmark tool built into the game. It is very convenient to see this, so I did kind of want to just show these results for those curious. So you can see ARC did over 12,000 frames. The 6700 XT did over 15,000, and then the 6900 XT had over 22K. So if we move on to 1440p now, the average is 56 for ARC, 66 for the 6700, and 99, just one short of 100 for the 6900 XT. So this is interesting because, it made me wonder, like, well, what happens if I ran this at ultra ray trace quality? I didn't do that for this video, but, it just tells you that ARC will just be less playable at this resolution. So if you want to get playable 60 at this resolution, you can do that with ray tracing enabled, but you will have to drop the preset down for the rasterization to make up the difference and bring the FPS average up. If we look at the minimums, this is pretty interesting. So here ARC's minimums were higher at 44 over 40 on the CC700 XT. So it is interesting to see, like ray tracing. I did notice that ray tracing does cause you to get some pretty bad minimums, some pretty bad frame spikes. at certain points when you're benchmarking. So that's just something that's an interesting observation for this title. And we look at the maximum FPS. Again, you can see there is a bit of a difference there in terms of how the Radeon card, so the 6700 XT, is able to push out a much higher maximum FPS compared to ARC. 135, that's like what, 36 FPS more at the maximum. It's an interesting thing because it does influence your averages. And then if we look at the frames rendered, 8,641 for ARC, and over 10K for Radeon, and then over like 15,600 for the 6900 XT. So this kind of shows you like they can push out max frames. That kind of correlates with your maximum and your average typically. So now we're going to move on to a game that was probably the most highly requested game. The other one was Minecraft, which unfortunately I do not have today, so I wasn't able to benchmark Minecraft. But I did benchmark Quake 2 RTX. I did try to live stream this on the previous live stream I did with ARC, but for some reason you cannot hook into the Quake 2 RTX game. It doesn't display with OBS or XSplit. There wasn't a way for me to capture it on screen without having to use like a dual PC setup or something like that. So these are the results for 1080p. These were actually surprising because initially I thought that the ARC and the 6700 XT in this title would be very, very close. But what I found interesting when I was benchmarking this game, Quake RTX, is when you're inside the building, so when you're outside, you get worst case scenario. Like ARC would drop 27. And then the Radeon card would be like 32, sometimes 29. I was seeing those kind of numbers when I was outside. That was like the worst case scenario. But then when you go inside the building and there's less of the God rays illuminating the screen, what I noticed is that the Radeon card, and when I say Radeon, I'm talking about the 6700 XT, because that's the primary card that we're comparing to, just to be clear on that. I noticed that the Radeon would shoot up to like 55. It was averaging around like 53 to 55 when you're inside areas where there's not a lot of reflections going on, and then ARC wasn't really able to get close to that, and that was the thing that was surprising, because basically the way I benchmarked this title is I ran through the first level before you get to the elevator to load the second level. That's basically what I played through. That was my play test for the benchmark, for those curious. It was the very first level. You basically run through, kill a bunch of dudes, and then like get to an elevator, and then it loads the next scene. So that's how I benchmarked it. And I did run through and get the secret shotgun weapon like in the wall. And it was when I was down there, that was when the Radeon card definitely was pulling ahead of the ARC GPU. The ARC GPU seemed like there was some kind of weird overhead bottleneck thing happening that was preventing it from really pulling close to like 50 FPS in like the darker areas. So that was something that was very interesting, because if you were to benchmark the two, like just outside where the God rays from the sun were like beaming down, they were very, very close. It was like 41. It was anywhere from like 31 to like 41, like that kind of range, like in the 30s. But then when you go inside, the Radeon card would do a lot better. So that was just an interesting observation. And then of course the 6900 XT, though it did do 74, I was not impressed with it because that's at 1080p. So that to me tells me that the performance is very much like first generation RTX, like RTX 2080 Ti, for instance. So if we bump this up to 1440p, now you can see none of them are really playable. It just gets a lot worse. In the case of the two, like the ARC and the 6700 XT, both of them drop below 30. They're not really playable. I think when you go inside in the dark areas, when you're trying to get that shotgun weapon, I think they're both like around 35 to 37, but that's like the best case that I was able to see. So really not a good showing for any of these GPUs, to be honest. Even the mighty 6900 XT, you know, with an abysmal 44, that's just not impressive at 1440p. So this is the sort of thing, though, that's interesting because this game is full path tracing. This is an example of of what ray tracing can really do when you just don't constrain it and you just literally have the light source bounce and create shadows off of like all the different textures. So fascinating test. It'd be interesting. It's interesting that not a lot of reviewers showcase this, so I really wanted to include this game because not only did I get several requests from viewers and subscribers, asking me to benchmark Quake 2 RTX, so I definitely wanted to provide that for you guys because I do think it is an invaluable result to kind of show us where these GPUs perform when it comes to worst case scenario full path tracing. And then it also kind of gives a really good reference point for the upcoming Radeon 7000 series cards, because if the flagship is only managing to do 44 at 1440p, we'll see like what the next flagship is able to do. So I'm pretty stoked to see that. But yeah, so that's gonna be Quake 2. Very interesting result. Probably the most interesting game that I benchmarked overall. All right, so next we're moving on to Resident Evil Village. So this is an interesting one. The ray tracing in this game is not super stressful on the GPU, I would say. You can see the results here look very good. So what I did, essentially in this game, in the menu, there's three or maybe four different ray tracing options. I turned all of them on while setting a custom preset basically to Ultra. So, the VRAM, the textures, everything was maxed out. So it was telling me like VRAM can get over 12 gigabytes of memory. So when I set my custom preset, it said in the video settings, this game can use over 12 gigabytes of memory. So that right there was interesting to me because that already eats up the entire frame buffer on the 6700 XT. I mean, and that could also do the same thing for like an RTX 3080 or 3080 Ti, right? So it was at 1440p especially. At 1080 it didn't really do that, but you can see the results here are really good. So 101 for ARC, 108 for the 6700 XT. So basically very similar overall. You wouldn't really be able to perceive a difference in FPS between those two, but the Radeon did outperform it by a small margin. And then of course the 6900 XT just killed it, 162. If we go up to 1440p, still very playable. Surprisingly, with all the ray tracing settings turned on and the custom profile or the custom preset where at this resolution, it was telling me that it can consume over 12 gigabytes of memory. I think the number was like 12.3 or 12.5 gigs of memory on the VRAM. And that is more than the 6700 XT has, because that's a 12 gigabyte card, just like the 3080 Ti and the 2080 Ti. So it's interesting, that it was consuming the full frame buffer, but I didn't really notice any severe hiccups or anything like that when I was playing the game on that card. Of course, the ARC and the 6900 XT have 16 gigabytes of memory, so they didn't have a problem with resources, but it is something that I did want to point out. And I did include this game because it does use Capcom's RE engine, so it's the game that they use for Devil May Cry 5, for all the recent Resident Evil remakes, like Resident Evil 2, 3, Village. I think even Resident Evil 7 was also based off of this engine. So very prolific engine that Capcom's used, and they've really got a lot of mileage out of it, I would say. So I did really want to showcase it here. And the results with the ray tracing do look really good. I mean, it seems like it's very well optimized, and it's a far cry from the results that we saw with Quake 2 RTX. Speaking of far cry, so now we're going to get into Far Cry 6, and this is going to be an interesting one that I wanted to include because it uses DXR. So the ray tracing engine or method that they use is based off of Microsoft's DirectX rays. So this was something that AMD worked together with Microsoft to optimize for the Radeon GPU. So I did want to kind of include this in here to see how well Intel's ARC GPU can handle this title and just kind of give us a window into how it handles DX ray tracing. So you can see here at 1080p, 74 FPS. So Not nearly as good as the other two, but it's not terrible. It's playable. So the good news is it is actually playable. I'm at 1080p. If we look at the minimum FPS, this further proves that it is playable because the minimum never went below 60. So the minimum was 65 at 1080p. So that's a really good result. Basically, in this game, there are 2 ray tracing settings that you toggle on, and that's it. Once they're on, you got ray tracing. So very, very straightforward to enable it. But with all those settings enabled and running at ultra, 65 as the minimum, very good result. And then with the Radeon cards, over 70, that's good too. So if we look at the maximum FPS, again, the Radeon cards, it looks interesting here because this looks like they just kind of scale linearly almost. And then you have your frames rendered. So this one, just like Tomb Raider, it did give me the total frames rendered, which I like to have that info if possible. And then 1440p, we have 58. So that's a little bit disappointing because in my review of the ARC GPU, I was saying that I recommend pairing this GPU up with a 1440p monitor, and I still kind of stand by that because not a lot of games use ray tracing, and I feel like you don't really need to run all the max settings with ray tracing enabled in order to get high fidelity visuals. Like, you can run ray tracing and you can turn down some of the other settings down to like high, in some cases medium. You can turn off like motion blur or whatever, and then you can get a slightly better result. So you can get 60 at this resolution, but it is a little disappointing because you can't just like set everything to ultra, turn ray tracing on, and just let it run. But with the Radeon cards, you can do that, as you can see here. So they have a lot of headroom. In particular, the top GPU could probably run this game at 4K, but we did not include 4K results in the ray tracing benchmarks because obviously this is about ARC, and you can see the results at 1440p aren't that good. So the 4K results would just be worse. If we look at the minimums aren't too bad considering that the average was 58, the minimum being 55. That's surprising, so it didn't really deviate too much from that. It's kind of a narrow range in terms of its operating FPS compared to the other two. And then if we look at the maximum, so the maximum it did was 67. So that, like I said, it is a very kind of a strict range that it renders the frames at in this title compared to the Radeon cards. And then if we look at the total frames rendered at 1440p, these are the results. So where does that leave us? Overall, this is the average results. So you can see the orange is going to be 1440p, and the blue is the 1080p. So in general, I would say if you want to turn on ray tracing and you want to use ARC A770 because it's an interesting new GPU from Intel, I would recommend 1080p. But certainly with 1440p, I don't really recommend ARC for 1440p ray tracing gaming. Like, if you're doing RTX on with ARC, you want to be on 1080p. Unfortunately, that's just kind of how it is right now. I don't know if driver optimizations will improve the ray tracing performance. I feel like if Intel can improve the rasterization results, I think we'll get better ray tracing results just in general. Because I think, like I said in my original review video for the rasterization, I think ARC over time can potentially improve and scale up so it's more in line with the 6700 XT from the Radeon team. So those results here, you can see it's a little bit behind it. It looks almost like it's a 6600 XT, or maybe like an old 5700 XT, even if that card could do ray tracing. So that's kind of what it looks like to me right now. But hopefully we'll get better mileage out of it over time, because I think that's the whole idea from Intel. The whole buy-in is, buy it now, but it'll get better over time. So it's kind of adopting that whole fine wine methodology that a lot of people claim the AMD cards have had, which to some extent I would say that is true, but it's kind of mixed, and I'm someone who has a lot of Radeon cards, so when people say AMD has fine wine, I can see why they say that, but I don't think that it's be all end all 100% guarantee. that it ages like fine wine. So anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you found this info, these ray tracing results from Intel's new ARC A770 insightful, and if it's useful in any way in terms of influencing you, whether or not you want to pick one of these up, or if you want to just hold out for Battle Mage, or if you want to get a Radeon card, or if you're just going to wait for Radeon 7000 series, or if you're just going to get something from Team Green. So either way, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. And if you really like this content and you like tech enthusiast type of things where it's in-depth coverage on things covering, you know, GPUs, CPUs, motherboards, RAM, tuning the PC, building the PC, all that kind of stuff, and as well as like game reviews and that sort of thing, we'll cover some of that on the channel as well from time to time, as well as live content where we do demo new games, we do go over like new hardware, we test things in real time. I like to engage with the audience and try things out. So if you like this kind of content, I think this is a good place for you guys. So feel free to subscribe and hit that bell icon if you would. It would help me out a lot. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. And I appreciate you guys for watching. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.